Hey everyone, welcome to Love, Rinse, Repeat, a podcast recorded on Gay or Muggle land by me, Liam Miller, he, him, his, a minister in the Uniting Church in Australia. Love, Rinse, Repeat is supported by Uniting Mission and Education, part of the Synod here in New South Wales and ACT, and I'm thankful for their support. My guest today is the wonderful Natalie Wig Stevenson. Natalie, welcome along.
Thanks so much for having me, Liam.
It's great to have you. So for those who don't know, Natalie teaches contextual education and theology at Emmanuel College of Victoria University in the University of Toronto. Her research
It's quite a mouthful. You can imagine. Like they fought a lot over all of those little connecting words.
Yes, I was like, should I say all of that? Should I just skip to University of Toronto? I'm like, I don't know. I don't want to get in a diplomatic situation.
Yeah, get me in trouble.
Yes. Her research explores how ethnographic methods can help create theological conversations across church, academy, and everyday life. She is also interested in feminist and queer theologies, cultural theories of practice, and practices for decolonizing higher education. Her current scholarly project uses ethnographic research to reimagine systematic theology as a form of performance art. And that's what we're talking about today. Her book, Transgressive Devotion, Theology as Performance Art, which is out now through SCM Press. Check it out. Great cover. Natalie, welcome. And let's start talking about the book. Where did this idea for theology as performance art come from?
Oh, that's a great question. I think you're the only person who's actually ever asked me that.
I thought that was like standard, like, just like
so
turn the title into a question. That's how you start, right?
I find my answers to lots of things about this book are, oh, I just really like that thing. And so that's where the idea came from. So for me, I just really loved studying performance art in my undergrad in art history. And back then I was sort of a conservative, charismatic evangelical, and the performance art kind of opened my eyes to new ways of thinking about the world, and then new ways of thinking about God in light of that. And then especially as you see in the opening to the book, as I was writing my doctoral dissertation, I had Marina Abramovich was performing The Artist is Present. This was 2010, and it had a live stream from MoMA. And to keep myself, I don't know if I kept myself sane, but to keep myself going, I had her going in the corner of my computer the whole time. And so I think it's just by osmosis. I kind of drew in that this was a really generative metaphor for thinking about what it is we do. It arose from the ethnography as well. I began to see that as a very collaborative project. And so in my first book, I talk about the ethnographic field as performance art, and then it grew from there into how ethnographic fieldwork can also disrupt theological systems as well in this sort of performative way, collaborative performative way.
So you mentioned the ethnographic work as well. So the book kind of weaves together, I guess there's kind of three threads to some extent. There's the performance art.
At least three.
At least, yes. Yes.
I'm still working them out myself.
Three prominent motifs or something run through. So there's each chapter begins with a reflection on, I guess, an infamous or famous work of performance art. It also then brings in conversations from a church basement that you had when you were an employee at a church. And then it also touches on your own, like, I don't want to put language on it, but like crisis of faith or a moment of, trying to explore your faith in a moment where it felt distant. So I guess when you started to sit down, did you have already the idea, okay, these are the three things that's going to guide this project, or did kind of one start just butting its way in as you went? And then I guess as it developed, how did you find that the three really helped complement or push against or rupture the work as you went through?
Well, I suppose I'd been working on the project on and off since the fieldwork, so for about 10 years. And it just took so much time to get all the pieces to come together. I knew I wanted the performance artworks framing each chapter. I knew I wanted to think about a different way to use ethnographic fieldwork in theological research, let's say, a new way to use that sort of differed from the just many wonderful ways it's been used before. But I was looking for a different way to use that field work. And at different points in the writing, I realized parts of myself were coming into it, and I was kind of I mean, I'm always a character in my writing. It's not the most scholarly thing, but I'm always constructing myself as a character in the text. And just kind of, the more I wrote it, the more I realized it's that crisis of faith that's guiding the whole thing. As the affect theory makes its way in, which I don't think is as prominent. I'm kind of working on some stuff now, trying to unpack what the affect theory is doing in there. As that came in, I realized more and more sort of the fundamental questions guiding each chapter of the book are ones that I've struggled with in my own faith. And so that started coming to the surface more in final drafts. But I mean, books go through tons of drafts always, but this one, like, more drafts than I could ever imagine. You know, I didn't know which performance artworks would be in each chapter when I started. It was like, it's an oddly systematic book, but as I'd work with sections, I'd realize, oh, this one goes here, this one goes here, this one, there were works that didn't make the cut, but things just kept moving around. And the more deeply those threads began to talk to each other, the more they would, which is why there were so many drafts. It's like the performance artwork would erupt something else, and I'd spend a day on YouTube watching videos of the artworks, and it would totally restructure what I thought I needed to say about salvation, but then that would go back and change something else. So it was a very intuitive, playful process of trying to get the pieces to talk to each other.
That's really helpful. And I think, so it's interesting that you're talking about like the systematic nature of the book, which there is, right? Like, you know, like we'll talk later about the way, you know, what you say about the Father relates to what you say about humanity, and, you know, the whole way through your Christology and the incarnation is touching on and problematizing and raising questions for all the doctrines. So it is.
Oh, that's an interesting read. I like that. I'm going to want you to say more about that.
All right. So there is this systematic thing, but it's also interesting the way you point out really early on that that in the context of systematic theology, fragmentation, incoherence, and rupture might not be such a bad thing, which, you know, there'd be certain systematic theologians who would balk at such a suggestion, or people maybe more so people who have who maybe have had bad experiences with systematic theology or have a bad idea of what it is, not necessarily what a lot of the time it actually is. But so talk to us a bit about this, the way incoherence and rupture and fragmentation play, and particularly as you started to kind of mention there how art played a role in that rupturing, in allowing you to force you to rethink and reframe a lot of what you were working on.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. I think there was sort of a moment in my own, see, this is what I said, it always comes back to something personal. There was something in my own sort of personal, I don't want to say development, but experience, let's say, where I came to really value structures and rules and the very things I thought I was trying to work against or break. And so systematic theology was one of those. It was the lowest grade I got in my MDiv. So like I did most poorly. It's like it was my only B in my whole MDiv. And so it's sort of ridiculous. I mean, maybe this tells you something about me. I had to go on and get a doctorate and become a theology teacher. But I hated it. I hated trying to get all that stuff to cohere that didn't really cohere. But then it started to feel like, well, my options were to do away with the system completely, or to sort of like just follow everything that it said, to work to get those pieces to fit. And I thought, well, there's value in both sides of that. And what happens if we actually let this system do what it's trying to do, to have that very strong structure that we're working with, and then we wrestle with it. So instead of throwing it away or denying that systems can do anything, what if instead we approach them differently? You know, and I think part of that came out of trying to think about justice in a broken world. I mean, that's not what I'm writing about in the book, but realizing that sort of old question of, can you use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house? I mean, I'm trying to use, in a certain sense, systematic theology against itself. But I think that's what it's supposed to be. It's not. I think that's when it's living. It's when we're continually intervening in it in different ways and bringing it back to life and making it work. That's sort of the dynamic of the academic and the everyday, the tradition and the practice. That's why you sort of like, they have to rupture each other if we're going to actually hold both with the value and love I think each deserve.
Yes.
Sense.
Yeah.
And that came from some art theory as well, out of Jacques Rancière, who talks about how art, when it's in its political function, will actually sort of rupture and rearrange a social imaginary. So these social imaginaries, the social structures within which we live, are powerful. We can't just overturn them. If we do, that comes with bloody revolution. There's no peaceful way to overturn them. And so he talks about how art doesn't show us something about those systems, but it actually rearranges how we experience them. It changes our perception. And so that was part of it as well, trying to think about, again, how do we bring more artistic mechanisms to the ways that we make theology, rather than, again, I think a common way of treating art in theology is to take an artwork and reflect upon it. I wanted to think, how does art actually work, and how can we make theology work similarly?
Yeah, I think that's really helpful and comes through a lot, and particularly even just not even in the sense of like, okay, I found this art that's an illustration of something that I already believe, right? And so I'm basically like, proof texting a lyric, or proof texting a stroke of a brush. It's actually allowing that to question what are you, what you're saying, what your theological claims you're making, the way you're making them. I think even I was going to get to this afterwards, but it kind of makes sense now when you talk about the chapter on ecclesiology. So a lot of the time we think about like ecclesiology of all the doctrines is very much a reflective exercise. You write about the church, or whether the church that is the church that you think should be, but as you say there, like, and people that have a corollary that like art reflects back to us. But as you say, art ruptures it and actually writes something into being. And so too, you say, ecclesiology is the act of like writing the church into being, not writing about, but writing the church into being. So maybe we'll jump in there on, talk to us a bit about that claim, about the nature of ecclesiology and how that shaped what you're up to in that chapter about the church.
Yeah, it's so that really comes out of the field work. There's a lineage in critiques of anthropological approaches that want to pull apart the idea that there's sort of a one-to-one correlation between what we encounter in the field and then how we write about it. Like the writing is just transparent. We're not actually inventing a new culture when we write about a culture, which comes with many power dynamics. It's being critiqued by people from sort of across the spectrum on critical race theory, feminist, queer, post-colonial. It was very much a colonial critique at the get-go. And so this idea of how do we represent something? What are we doing when we represent something? And I wanted to take that to think, what are we doing when we try to represent the church? I can't, which church would I write about? the one that we have or the one we want to have? Yeah. And there are enough debates and ethnographic approaches to theology between those who want to write about the church we want to have think that ethnographic theologians are just writing about the church, the material church, which isn't the real one. And ethnographic theologians want to say, well, you're not writing about the real one either, because you're not writing about the concrete one. And so I wanted to write, again, performatively from the space between those two, to try to write into being, write into existence, as one would do with the writing of a culture in anthropology, right into being that church that doesn't exist, but also does, that's fleeting, that is caught only for a moment in the performance, in the performing of the words as we read it in that moment, and bring sort of our different contexts to bear on it. Does that answer the question? I feel like I'm still trying to work out what I was doing there. Like when in the final draft, my husband read it and he said, is this your idea? Writing the church into being? And I was like, yeah, I'm pretty sure it's my idea. And he's like, that's a really good idea. I was like, I know. This has to go to publication now, but I feel like there's implications there that I haven't figured out yet. And thanks for being surprised that was my idea. But I'm still playing with it. It's like, what is this performative thing we do? If we think some form of revelation of what's possible, and I don't just mean like socially possible, but the revelation of what God might be doing among us is actually possible through the writing of theology, then well,
Mm.
we just need to write better theology. But also I want to think, then what is the power of the act of writing? What are we doing there?
Mm.
Are these, I mean, I don't know if I say it anywhere in the book. I kind of think of them as writing spells, which I know is very problematic language for many Christians, but this is sort of we have no
Mm.
problem with writing liturgies, but writing spells,
Mm.
these invocations, theological text
Yeah.
is writing into being, writing into presence.
Totally. That comes like, when you come to the conclusion, you talk about like, I don't think that like, okay, you've read this book, right? And that's it's done then, and it's like, and the book is a record of like the work you've done. It's like the book is a performance, the book is a act, as you say, of this, putting this out and performing this theology, this transgressive devotion. So I think that's, yeah, that comes through as well. So let's jump way back.
Okay.
So the first chapter is on the Father,
Yes.
is on God, and begins with this conversation in the church basement that leads to conversations around Alzheimer's, dementia, and the like. And so talk to me then about God's faulty memory,
Mhm.
and then employing cognitive impairment as a framework for considering the power-laden social dynamics through which God might be trying to visit us.
Are those my words? Did you
Yeah,
see me?
that last bit was a quote. Yeah,
I was
yeah,
like, that sounds like something I would say.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think, for anyone who's listening who hasn't come across the book yet, it's probably important before this to say that I am not arguing in this book that God has dementia. That there's a question that frames the whole sort of like descent and reemergent journey that I'm trying to use the book to take people on, that comes out of this moment of sort of waking up one day and realizing I no longer believed in God. And just, spoiler alert, I do again. But this book is trying to write out of that moment where I realized there's a bunch of things I could do to try to regain my faith. I could read this book, I could do this thing. And I was feeling very compelled in that moment to sit with that horrible feeling of loss. And as I sat with it, there was sort of this movement of, I don't believe in God. I have forgotten God. But what it feels like is that God doesn't believe in me. God has forgotten me. And so I had been sitting on this piece from my field work where we had begun to we'd been talking one night about how to try to wrap our heads around God's eternity, which is obviously something you can't wrap your head around. And one of the people in these classes I was teaching shared this story about a vacation she had gone on with where a friend of a friend they were at a cabin, a friend of a friend was there who had dementia. And so what the person in this narrative was sharing, Ricky is her name in the text. For a second, I thought I'd said her real name. No, Ricky is her name in the text. Was saying, this woman was living with a kind of timelessness because she couldn't sort of anticipate what was about to happen. She didn't remember what had just happened. So she was living in this timeless state, and she wasn't romanticizing the woman's experience. She was really sharing it in a compelling, complex way, and said, but this is sort of a way of understanding God's eternity. It's the closest we can come to that sort of timelessness. And so this image of God living with dementia, that dementia being some sort of version of the characteristic of God's eternity, really stuck with me. I tried to write it into the dissertation. I clearly wasn't ready for it. Ended up having to scrap that chapter and do something else entirely. And it sat with my imagination. So it came back to me when I was trying to make sense of the loss of faith. The feeling was being forgotten by God. Came back to me as I started trying to write this book. This became a very significant image in my own faith. So all that to say, I'm not saying God has dementia, because what would that even mean? But we've had this arc throughout Christian history of being willing to entertain the vulnerability of God, the erosion of God's power, particularly in the 20th century. I'm drawing on Jürgen Moltmann in this book, trying to make sense of extreme suffering and the powerlessness of God. This arc into disability theology, where we begin to really, imagine God with physical disabilities, like through Nancy Iceland's work. But I was struck in the research that I just couldn't come across anything that was willing to think alongside a cognitive disability for God. Right? God is just still too much mind in our imagination, I think. And so I wanted to think with that. If the experience that I'm having that I think might resonate with others of feeling forgotten by God has a potency to it that explains some part of the affect of Christian faith, um, then how do we respond in those moments? How do we remain
Mm,
responsible? Is the language I bring up in the conclusion or the final chapter of a theological anthropology in response to that vision of the Father. How do we stay engaged with this God who we think has forgotten us? We not think, we feel has forgotten us. So then that let me sort of dig into this pastoral care material around how to care for people living with dementia, and the different ways we engage with their reality, the reality we're living in, how to sort of work with both of those, not make one or the other primary, which, I mean, even as I'm saying this is the kingdom of God. This is the language we use in Christianity of the already, the not yet, the holding together different realities and trying to live as if they're simultaneously true. And so yeah, then trying to imagine, okay, what are these patterns and ways that we should be interacting as neurotypicals with people? Well, I'm not neurotypical, but how might a neurotypical person interact, or someone who doesn't have dementia with someone who has dementia? Can those give us hints and clues to how we might interact with God in the space of forgetting? So none of this is trying to make these claims that that's what God is, that's what we
mm,
are, but we live in this affective space so often, and yet that's not a thing that we necessarily theologize about or from the affective space rather than the problem or the solution, right?
mm,
So I didn't want to write God is forgotten or God has remembered. I wanted to write from that ache
mm,
of feeling forgotten by God and trying to respond to God in that.
mm. Thank you. And yes, so you bring up then like the way that then ties into that chapter on humanity. As you say, you bring in with work, thoughts about attunement and what
Yeah.
it is to be caregiving um, to, to to someone whose memory is failing them or has gone. Um, I'm curious about like ways that you think you've ever seen or yourself have practiced that caregiving, like what that might look like, or
Mm.
glimpses of that you feel like you've seen or have heard recollected in the Christian life. Like, what does it look like, or could it look like for someone to be engaging that act of caring for God, the God who has feels like has forgotten us.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, there's two arenas of life in which attunement has become really important to me. And so attunement is, some people would say attunement and empathy are the same thing. Folks who would want to distinguish them would kind of say that empathy can actually take you too far into the other person. Attunement is the capacity to have empathy while maintaining good boundaries. And so, and not just for self-protection, but to really honor the fact that someone is experiencing things differently than you are. So it's not walking in their shoes, it's walking with them, which,
Mm,
walking in their shoes is a common way of describing empathy, but it's actually working from that place of difference in a really listening and powerful way. And so I think, I've, as I was writing this, I was in relationship with two people living with dementia. Um, and one of my greatest fears of the book is that it will be perceived as overly playful with dementia, and I just couldn't bring myself to write about the two people who I was actually experiencing this with, um, and 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 trying to remain in a relationship after I've been forgotten. It's very, very painful, but in those relationships and writing this at the same time, I was finding these moments of, oh, we find new ways to find each other. Sometimes it would be just fine and the person would remember me. Other times it was sort of like I would be trying to tap into our affective connection, whether or not they knew who I was. They knew they liked me. Something like they knew they liked their hand being touched by me. We could sing a song. There are these moments of just needing to follow the lead of the other person, while still listening into their reality with them. And the other place attunement has become really important to me is having young children. A friend who was a therapist told me that there are psychoanalysts who will say it's actually more important to attune to your children than to love them. I don't know what I make of that, but I think attunement is a form of love, and that's trying to sort of inhabit the reality of my kids and really think, what is it they're seeing right now? What is it they are feeling and perceiving? So, and then responding to that, responding as myself to that need that's coming up for them, rather than responding to the need I think they have or trying to become them in that need, but really trying to actually allow that differentiation to happen.
Yep.
And discern that. So I think both of those modes of attunement became interesting to me in thinking about divine and human agency as that mutual attunement. And, this gets the reason that chapter can't go right next to the Fathers, because we got to go through all the other stuff to get there. But this significance of how borders between divine and human operate, and differentiation, self-differentiation, ecstatic overflow into each other, all that stuff happens in the middle of the book. So then this is trying to come back to, right, again, and we are other. There can be ecstatic union, that's in chapter 5. But then we come back to everyday life, and that's where the attunement becomes necessary, the deep, deep listening to each other.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's really, really helpful.
And then acting in the kingdom. I know that's a very problematic term. I've had a really hard time letting go of it. So listening to, what is it that God's trying to do, even though God is so often in our world held back from doing it? Listening into being a part of that is kind of what I'm trying to get at there.
Yeah, fascinating. I think another interesting little note in that chapter you're talking about, that this whole idea provides a way of thinking anew about why don't Christians get along, or why are there so many just radically different experiences and expressions of God, or what it means to follow God. And you're kind of using this image of, well, maybe God's not saying the same thing to everyone, as happens when you're spending time with people who's in cognitive impairment and dementia. It's you might not hear the same thing about an incident, and it's just another great example of how, as you say, you're not kind of making some existential commentary on what has happened to God, or what, because again, what would that mean? But by approaching this and spending that time in how this feels and in the possibility of this imagery, and it opens up a whole lot of things that press on really key fundamental questions that often get overlooked, in how do we account for this.
Well, they're the things. I want to play just for 5 extra seconds with all the things we shut down immediately. So it's sort of can I stay close to the trouble for a minute? And so, someone were to say, well, God seems capricious. The response is, God's not capricious. God totally knows what God's doing. And I thought, well, what if we just give 5 minutes perhaps of thinking, oh, look, I've already stretched it from 5 seconds to 5 minutes of thinking maybe God is capricious. If we just stayed in that moment for 5 hours, maybe we could find a way to work together, coalitions.
I think that's really, really helpful. So let's move to the chapter on the Spirit.
All right. Here we go.
I'm excited to talk about. So if you thought the flirting with dementia was going to be something, get ready, folks. So there's an extended consideration in this chapter of the role of the Spirit in the conception of Christ.
Yes.
I mean, there's a few bits. We got a little bit of time in this chapter. But this is, I think, a really fruitful, though, as you kind of comment, indecent reflection. So talk to us a bit, I guess. I really think particularly what you're hoping to break open in this chapter, particularly as you're trying to, I think, move toward this. What does it mean to have an unsafe way of knowing God? And you're drawing on Beatrice here.
Beatrice
like
Nazareth.
Everyone knows.
Yes. Beatrice. Mystic Beatrice of Nazareth.
Yes.
And Marcella Altus Reed is in there.
Yeah.
It's a good little mix.
It is. So talk to us a bit about what you're trying to break open with this consideration of the Spirit, in this conversation of the conception of Christ, and pushing through that toward how we relate through the Spirit to God.
Yeah. So if the Father and the humanity chapters come together around this question of how do I respond when I feel like I've been forgotten by God, and that sort of aching question, chapters 2 and 5, Spirit and salvation, come together around this question of what does it mean to be terrified of God? And I think that for me comes out of, again, having this background in conservative, charismatic evangelicalism,
Mm.
and feeling like, God can just take over you. That's completely fine. And then getting this sort of education in feminist theology of like, now we're going to really sort of speak back against sort of classical feminist theology. Power is problematic. We don't want to be, God is not an overcoming, overpowering God. God is a loving, gentle, tender God. And I thought, well, I kind of know both to be true. And those are parts of, again, my own faith that I don't want to choose one over the other. I want to figure out how to hold on to both. I won't say integrate them, but hold on to both of them. And so that's the question animating that one. Can I sit with the terror of being overcome by God? And what does that look like? And so Mary became really important in exploring that question, because that's her, that's her story. And again, this, there's so many parts of this book I wrote that, there's we might end up talking about the stuff around the virus and being willing to take on a virus. I wrote all of that before COVID. I had to go back in and tidy it up a lot in light of the experience of COVID. But same with this one, I wrote the stuff about Mary, before Me Too broke. And Me Too definitely helped me get it to much closer to where I wanted it to be. A sort of a brilliant colleague of mine, Gerard Gunnes in Norway, had been writing about Mary as a Me Too moment. And I think sort of the conception of Christ as a Me Too moment. And so I wanted to get into that narrative more of, well, what's happening there, right? I don't want to deny that there's a power imbalance at play. I think that there are theologians who will do that, sort of say like, God's not overtaking us. This is because God is good. I said, well, again, like, I don't just want to say that. It's not a
Mm.
particularly meaningful statement for people who've been in those kinds of power imbalances.
Mm.
And there's no point in denying that that's an unbridgeable power balance when Mary is asked to do this thing. So what would it be to imagine Mary giving consent, which we would now say is impossible with that level of power imbalance? What would it mean for her to have given consent to that truly? Can we dig into that? I wanted to dig into that a little bit more. And we have narratives in queer theory, queer theology, queer practice, around how to navigate and play with power imbalances in erotic relationships. And so I wanted to bring those to bear on that moment of her saying yes. I wanted to understand that moment when she said yes
Mm.
in the
Thank
midst of the terror, because she's
Yes.
this prototype for our prayer lives. I want to know when I'm praying that it's real, that there's danger and wonder and actual life-changing possibilities and a relationship and a mutual one, and really navigating, if I'm saying there's a mutual relationship there, what do I do with one side of that relationship having a lot more power than I do, without then negating the significance of God's power?
Mm. Yeah, thank you. That is because one of, I think being on Twitter every November or so, this Mary consent discussion is going to it emerges, right?
Right.
And
It is
runs
from
its
now
course.
on. Yeah.
Yeah, and will, yeah. And I think this is a really helpful way to think about it, and to think about, and particularly bringing in the role of the Spirit as a lover,
Mhm.
provides a way through that's not as simple like, well, yes, no, God's good and Mary had all the power in the world, and also not simply, yep, it's written off as anyway possibly a story and a figure that we can draw near to as helpful. So I think, yeah, it is really, really great in that regard. So the chapter pushes through, and I guess you could say the indecenting continues, as you turn from what the night of Christ's conception to bug chasing communities, and to viruses and becoming infected, as you think anew about the two-way openness of the
Mhm.
Spirit, which I think is an important aspect in that the Spirit is open both to humanity and to God, and thus there can be this mutual movement between the two. And you're right here. I'll just read a short bit at the end. Having explored this kind of idea, these bug chasing communities and virus, says, is it so strange to embrace life-threatening infection as the root of one's redemption? Christians do it all the time, or at least we should. The risk of being infected will, of course, look different for each one of us, as will what it means to be open to radical alterity. Only unprotected arousal in the spirit can lift our humanity into the timeless abyss of God's own broken memory. So talk to us a bit about this move. And again, I guess it's that thing of, you talked before about wanting to stay 5 more minutes, or we're up to 5 hours. I'm not sure what.
Yeah.
Say 5 weeks with those tough,
Yeah.
those tough conversations about God. In some way, here you're also saying, I want to stay longer with those communities that we want to immediately knee-jerk dismiss or reject as holding any way of teaching us something about goodness, let alone something about God, let alone something about our salvation. So I think there's a similar thing at play here of wanting to stay long, which obviously, as you say, this chapter draws on Marcella Althus-Reed, who pushed for this kind of thing, to actually think about real bodies and real people and how we actually live in our sexual lives. So yes, there's barely a question there, but an invitation.
Please respond.
But an invitation into just talking a bit more about that, because I think it's really a wonderful chapter, and and I'm just curious to talk a bit more about it.
Yeah, so to go back to Marcella Althus-Reed, her project of indecenting is trying to pull apart the ways that heteronormative practice and just the heteronormative shaping of the society within which we live shapes our theological imagination, and that needs to be broken. That also enslaves our theological imagination to a capitalist imagination as well, because of the, well, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, this is an argument that many of us know by now. So what she wants to do is break this in very, I suppose I would say, almost violent ways. I mean, people find her work quite upsetting, and if we don't, we probably should. So I'm trying to do something similar, and I often go back to that chapter and just to double check that I haven't actually condoned the practices that I write about. I keep having these panic moments of, did I say that we should all be doing that by accident somewhere, and trying to make sure I didn't. So the indecent practice that I draw on in that chapter is a sexual subculture that refers to themselves as bug chasers, and this is the group of it's not like maybe they get together, I don't know, but the practice involves eroticizing the HIV virus and participating in unprotected sex to try to contract the virus, which of course leads to its spread as well. And so I'm not condoning this behavior, but I found myself following Kent Brintnell's work around the practice to be really compelling for thinking, what is it that in me that gets repulsed when I hear that kind of a narrative? And I spent so much time with it that it sort of became a bit like my daily norm. And now that people are reading it, they're saying, I can't get through that chapter. And I think, oh my gosh, why did I put it second? But it is like, what is it that's upsetting me there? And COVID became really helpful for thinking of this, because I kind of was forced to live it in a sense of like, why are people going to these stupid COVID parties? Why are people so selfishly spreading this virus that's destroying lives? And it made me go back into this bug chasing HIV piece of why are they doing it? What is driving them? And wanting to understand how someone would want to eroticize a deadly virus. And Brintnell's work around that is this not wanting to say it's suicidal ideation and pathologize it in that way, but to think about this sort of erotic ruination, the willingness to be, the desire to be destroyed by something, and how that actually resonates with a lot of our Christian narratives of, dying with Christ to live with Christ. And that kind of language is actually quite common in bug chasing communities of death and life being deeply, deeply connected. And that, modern subjectivity, the way in which we understand what it is to be human, really depends on a shoring up of self that is always taking a toll on someone else. Right? It's always, my capacity to be any version of coherent is always dependent upon the incoherence of others. My wellness is dependent on others' harm. And so the bug chasing moment sort of brings that into very stark, immediate contrast. But it's the nexus at which we're supposed to be living as Christians and really questioning what is it that I'm trying to protect for myself socially and then also theologically when I want to resist divine movement in my life. But then what threat in that comes to God as well, in God's openness to us. So you didn't really have a question. I'm not sure I really had an answer.
No, it's really great.
Somewhere we just said a bunch of cool stuff.
Yeah, yes. Oh, absolutely. And I
Yeah.
think what was interesting in that chapter was almost like I think some of what you're like feeling there of like, was it the right move to introduce this conversation into this book is parallels to when you're in the conversation of the church basement of, was it the right move to bring up Beatrice? Like with her whole desire to be obliterated by God and to be dominated and all that exactly that language is there, not only in her, in other mystics too. And we have a lot of, as you say, the folks in that basement had a lot of trouble with that. That yes, although as you say, they come around in their own interesting ways, but that yes, that was so difficult for so many people to get. And so I think, as you say, that's a, why is that even in a religious setting, this idea so troubling for a lot of people, it parallels across, which is why it's such a fruitful chapter. So
and that's why it comes back up again in sort of ecstatic masochistic salvation imagery in the salvation. I'm pointing to chapter 5 because it's this, drawing on this philosophical work from Carmen McKendrick around the mystics, so-called mystics, and how what we see as obliteration of self is really an intensification of self and ecstatic overflow, and trying to bring sort of that back then into who it is God makes us in salvation.
Yeah, thank you. It's really wonderful the way these chapters all speak to each other. So look out for that, folks, as you read it. It rewards it. It rewards reading it close together. So the incarnation, I think one thing that's so interesting about what you write there is, which I think drives so much of what's going on, is the incarnation introduces a problem for God, which I think is just such a fundamentally astute observation that one is probably overlooked a lot, and two should give us way more freedom than we often let it. Because we come, we're 2-something thousand years into this whole thing now. So the idea of God becoming flesh and being born and being dependent and being vulnerable to everything and then getting killed, is somewhat softened by familiarity. But it really does open so many questions and problems, as you say, that I think, you don't only explore that in the incarnation chapter, you explore that in the chapter on the Son, you explore that elsewhere. But I guess, I'm curious a bit about like, what are ways that, thinking about, your own work, but what you see out there that you think we often like the key aspects of that problem that we most quickly overlook. What are some of the things that you think you just see regularly, we just take for granted, but actually you're like, no, spend the 5 minutes, and here's at least 4 questions I can think that are not necessarily easily resolvable. You don't have to actually like list off these questions, but I'm just curious about your thoughts on this idea of the incarnation introducing a problem and how perhaps we allow it to do so because it's this there be treasure.
It's the line that you're referencing began as it introduces a whole problem to theology, and the more I sat with it, I was like, actually introduces a whole problem into God. That's why it's a problem for theology, but we're so far from it, and we just settled that with the creeds. Here's the ways we can now talk about it, but actually the reason people were panicking, or one reason people were panicking in those early centuries, is because of the problem it caused for God, where we were trying to protect God from God's own choices. And so that began to sort of intrigue me. We put the tightest sort of borders on Christ's body, because if we let those get permeable, then goodness me, God shouldn't have made that choice, because now everything's on the table. So So, but what are the questions that we don't? That's so good. I mean, what do you think they are? You must have one if you're asking that question. Oh, yeah.
That's not why I do it. That's not
You
why
look panicked there.
That's not why I host a podcast.
Yeah, no, you need to ask the questions.
Well, I think even one, I think, like, you think about, like, so we often want to stress like the full humanity of Jesus, right? Like it's necessary, right? If this whole thing is going to work, the whole creed thing is going to work. But then even you know, but we then want to remove so many aspects of what it means to be human. Like, so could Jesus have died of like sudden infant death syndrome, right? You know, or you know, another option is, you know, so what does it mean? What was Jesus doing in puberty? As puberty came in, and as anyone who goes through puberty knows, you don't necessarily have a lot of control over your thoughts, and you know, so what does it mean to
your flesh?
Or your flesh, exactly. Yes,
yeah.
You know, so what does that mean, and what does it mean to think about that as the one we claim was in full or perfect obedience through his life? How much does, you know, how much is what Jesus thinks about God and his mission influenced by, you know, his mother and those around him? You know, so I think like there's a lot of that stuff. If we start to think about what it actually means to be fully human, and we think about what it means when we think of ourselves as the full aspects of our humanity, that there's some things that come up there. I mean, that's just some, but I think that's
great.
A part of it. Yeah.
I think, so one of the things I notice, I mean, I think, again, like part of living a life in very conservative Christianity and very liberal Christianity, and wanting to find the God who lives across both, is part of this. You know, I know in some communities, like, we cannot talk about Jesus' humanity. It's this intense, like, high Christology, highly divine, which is not orthodox. And then on the other side, it's sort of like, well, he was just a really great teacher, and he's fully human and maybe like a little bit divine, or some special knowledge. Like, that's not orthodox either. And both frankly are just kind of too boring for how great God is. Is that an okay thing to say? It's like, actually, again, I want to stay close, like build resilience at the place of, like, what is it for flesh to be divine? That language of flesh is so compelling. I won't even go down that rabbit hole, but this idea that, like, flesh, even more than body, I think of Ashton Crawley's distinction between flesh and body. Of flesh is not body yet. Flesh is not what we think of as, like, constructed body, coherent, gendered, raced, etc. body. But flesh is somehow the thing that's put together in that construction, and that flesh has divinity to it, is by God's choice, by God's decree, is that our flesh becomes divinized too. That's what our flesh contributes to our divinization. I don't know. I'm just talking off the cuff now, but that's where you go. It's like meaty. It's meaty flesh. It's our animalness. It's
when you think about then that, like, so like the only stuff in the universe is the stuff that's always been in the universe, right? There's not new. It's just rearranged and brought forth. So all that which made the flesh of Jesus, the body of Jesus, had, like, you know, existed from jump. However you want to configure that, but like, and are just, you know, being reconfigured and adapted and reused and recycled into bodies and into the earth and into all that again, and into animal and again, and then comes there. And I guess the question blew
my mind.
And I guess the question there is then, if, depending on how you configure bodily resurrection and ascension, is there a little less stuff in the universe since Jesus has, since
like
33 AD?
150 pounds less stuff.
Yeah.
I'm just guessing Jesus' weight. I just assume people were skinnier back then.
It wasn't as much food for sure.
Yeah.
But yeah, so, like, you know, is that at one moment is all of a sudden to be a little less stuff. Anyway, but like it's as you said, there's a lot of that you can start pulling and working on, which I think, and isn't, I think, as you say, isn't masturbatory, isn't like just a thing, isn't just like you know, the thing that academics do to speculate because they have to like warrant their thing. It's
I thought we were back to Jesus's team.
Sorry, I really paused before using that word.
Yes, he did. Yeah.
Good. We covered that. Actually, I can just note
Yes,
that
check.
we've done that question now.
If Mary gets to have an orgasm in chapter 2, Jesus gets to masturbate in chapter 3. I tried to stop myself from saying that and it was already out. I'm going to regret that. I'm
That's all
already
right.
blushing.
No,
This is one
no.
thing I have to say. What I write is way more risque than like how I actually feel comfortable talking or being. So when people start asking me questions about the book, I'm just like sweating because I'm much cheekier on paper.
That's great.
Yeah.
No, that's wonderful. And I think, there's some joke, but I can't remember it now. I was going to say it.
So it's not just academics saying stuff. It's like there's
Yeah.
meaning here, is what I think you're trying to get at. And
yeah, absolutely. And there's something that you push through it, and then sometimes it leads to something really fruitful, and other times it doesn't. But it's the pursuit, which I think is great.
It's the formation that happens in the pursuit. It's the willingness to go to the bit that isn't allowed to. It's like heretics. We're like 49% of the people who are making the decisions, and we just called them heretics. So it's like, maybe there's some good in that 49% that we could just dip our toe in for a little bit and then take a swim and submerge, depending on the resilience you build each time.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Well, and this should obviously show, I hope folks are very excited to go and pick up the book. We could talk another hour and a half. It's been so wonderful, but I should let you go and enjoy your afternoon. The book, folks, is Transgressive Devotion, Theology as Performance Art, out through SCM Press. Go and check it out, pick it up. It's a really excellent read. I want to note we have a very passionate Schleiermacher contingent who listens to the podcast. Schleiermacher gets play in the chapter on the sun, so go and check it out.
Yeah, but if you're a serious Schleiermacher contingent, you might not like it.
No. My Schleiermacher peeps are very open to help. And much worse has been said about Schleiermacher, and much less justifiably for a long time. So you give a good engagement with him. It's really good. And I mean, like, that's something I really loved about the book too, is, we talked about the ethnography, the performance art, your own story, but like the breadth of the theological voices that you engage from chapter to chapter is really exciting and commendable.
Well, Schleiermacher's in there because I was walking the Camino and I was trying to make sense of the experience. And one day I just kind of stopped and went, I think Schleiermacher's right about reality. So it's not, I know as an academic theologian, it's not the way we're supposed to, that's not what I'm supposed to do with Schleiermacher. And yet it's like, all right, well, he's helping me make sense of this very moment and experience of God. And I've got to listen to that.
That is wonderful. That's great. That's so funny. I love it.
But to be fair, I think Bart was right too. Everyone, just before everyone goes up on the on that side of the debate.
That's actually, this is the more controversial part, not the orgasm masturbation talk.
It's
now we've
yeah.
got the Schleiermacher part. Now we actually have to stop this conversation.
Yes, I'm sorry for saying something so offensive. That there's good in both of those guys.
That's brilliant. Natalie, is there anything else you want to promote or plug or draw people's attention to at this moment?
Oh my goodness, no.
Are you doing is there a devotional?
Oh yes, I should say that. I mean, hopefully it's running at some point. So I'm working on a course that will be, well, now it absolutely will, because I'm about to say this out loud. It's going to be completely free. I just think ministers are probably really exhausted at the end of COVID. So I'm trying to pull together an online devotional companion for the book, fully free access that just gives people the chance to rest and rejuvenate a little bit theologically, just something that I want to create to feed ministers' souls. I have a few ministers have had really nice things to say about the book and how it's really helped them
great.
to have their own sort of like little theological play. So this will be that. I'm hoping it'll be put together by the end of the year, but watch me on Twitter. I'll certainly be letting you know what's my Twitter handle, @NatalieWS.
Great.
You'll be able to find the course.
That's a good handle. Like that's
I got that early on.
Yeah.
I was on Twitter when it first started. Then I took about 12 years off.
Probably the right way to do it, really.
Yeah.
Didn't miss much. That's great. Yeah, I'm really excited for that. I'm one of those ministers who'll say I'm saying it now, who really appreciated this work. One of my favorite things I've read this year is really exciting and fruitful and gets you thinking. And I was drawn to it. And I think, as you say, one of the things I really appreciate you say is this is based on, like, real questions that you were wrestling with. And I think they're real questions that a lot of people wrestle with in one form or another. And I think that's really helpful. And if anything, one thing that does make you it really makes you want to get in a basement with a bunch of folk and talk about faith. Like those stories from there, you're like, yeah, man, I want to, I think especially with COVID, because of so few of that stuff actually happening.
I know.
I want to,
get
in a room and hash it out. And
well, that is the first book. Ethnographic Theology has a lot more of those in it, which is also in paperback now. So if
great.
you like the church basement, the whole first book is set in the basement, pretty much.
I love that. So folk, check that out as well. Well, Natalie, thank you so much for joining us. Hopefully we'll have you back on sometime. It's been a wonderful conversation. All the best going forward, and everyone will see you next week.